So let's just talk a little bit more about Fukuyama to kind of sum things up a little bit. The 20th century was an era of ideological conflict, starting with liberalism versus absolutism of sorts, and then it morphed into a new conflict between liberalism in the middle and two extreme ideologies on the far left and far right, Marxist-Leninism and the various forms of fascism, respectively. And then after World War II, after an alliance of necessity between liberalism and communism on the one hand and fascism on the other, by 1945, with the entry into the post-war period, fascism was vanquished and the natural antagonism, the natural rivalry between liberalism and communism resurfaced in what we call the Cold War. And the Cold War lasted from about 1946 to 1991. Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, providing the world with this very powerful metaphor for this stark and hostile division between the command economies and the communist dictatorships of the East, of the Soviet sphere, and later to be joined by China under Mao Zedong in 1949. And on the other hand, what people in the West like to call the free world or the first world, the world of democratic capitalism, or in other words, liberalism. So this Cold War narrative continued on for much of the second half of the 20th century. But by 1989, clearly this conflict was starting to fall by the wayside and be replaced by something else, something different, something new. And scholars jockeyed about to try to pinpoint or articulate most accurately what that new concept would, or new model for international relations and world politics would really look like. So Fukuyama's thesis statement is contained in the fourth paragraph, where he says, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such, which he defines as the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of government." So when he says the end of history, he's not talking about the end of the world. He's not talking about some sort of religious or nuclear apocalypse. He's not even talking about the end of problems or the end of challenges, but rather he's talking about the end of major problems and major challenges, because indeed that would just be kind of the physical, superficial manifestation of the end of profound ideological challenges amongst the great powers, amongst the great states. And as long as most of the world, including all of the great powers, to varying degrees, but ultimately are on board here, have committed to the realization that democratic governments and capitalist economies and the integration of the two into one world system really is the way of the future. And so that's what he means. It's an end of ideological conflict. And because Fukuyama is an idealist in the sense that he believes that material, economic, physical forces are really sort of just the reflections of the more profound forces of the ideological, metaphysical sphere, he believes that with this point, what we really can look forward to from 1989 onwards is basically more of the same. More liberalism and more capitalism and more democracy. All right, so whether or not he thinks that's good or bad, well, he's somewhat ambivalent toward it, which we will talk about in just a minute. But before we get there, there's a few other points about Fukuyama's essay that I wanted to explain to you as you read, so it'll make a little bit more sense. Now, when exactly did the end of history begin? And how can we define it in terms of, political theory? Well, he mentions the date 1806 and the Battle of Jena as part of the Napoleonic Wars. But really, you could go back 30 years before, to 1776, with the Declaration of Independence of the North American colonies from Great Britain, and the famous language of the Declaration: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And this notion of a social contract between the rulers and the ruled, which is geared toward protecting the rights of the ruled, the rights of the people. And then the consolidation of the American Revolution and the repackaging politically of the Revolution in the form of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, 1788, and then the French Revolution, which broke out in 1789. These revolutionary movements in America and France especially, but elsewhere, were the first kind of steps, or the first inculcations toward this post-historical environment, politically speaking. Now, what's been going on then over the last 200 and some years is that slowly but surely, almost inevitably, Fukuyama would argue, the world has been steadily coming around to those ideas, to those political systems and cultures. So I talked in depth about the history of the early 20th century, and then I took you through the rest of the 20th century. But ultimately, the first post-historical societies were the societies that emerged as fully liberal societies all the way back in the late 18th centuries, the late 1700s. And so it's probably no surprise that the countries that have been so-called post-historical nations for the longest periods of time, the United States, France, and Britain, are also kind of widely regarded as amongst the most politically stable, prosperous, free, and secure nations in the world today. And in the case of the United States, certainly one of the most dynamic and powerful countries that history has ever seen. So anyway, when Fukuyama talks about liberalism as representing the end of history, because this is the system that is, kind of the final point of mankind's ideological evolution, it's important to take into consideration this concept of a contradiction. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about in my next lecture. Hold on one sec.